Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, bootlicker shills, debt slaves, serfs, peasants, vassals, minions, meat sacks. I'm Useful Eight. Welcome. And let's talk about the election of 2016. But let's start out by talking about the election of 1964. And one of the reasons why I like to use history as a context for everything is because a lot of these things we see, even in this election, are really nothing new under the sun. So sometimes my cool Zen approach, as some viewers have described, or my sense of detachment, is because I've just seen this stuff a million times, and those things I haven't experienced myself in the election cycles of previous years, I can read about in history and find out that very little has changed. So the 1964 election is pretty instructive, particularly a book I read just recently, How Timely, is very instructive. And this is the book. It's called A Choice, Not an Echo, and an inside story of how presidents are chosen. And it's by a woman who was a delegate at Republican conventions for several years in a row. So she knows the inner workings, but she wrote this book back in 1964, and I read it, and I was struck by a lot of the similarities to a lot of the mechanisms we see right now, and particularly looking at, for example, Goldwater and Trump, Donald Trump being run this year. But let's get right into some of these details in this book, because there's a lot there, and I don't want the video to run too long as usual. But she talks about in 1948, 1952, 1956, and 1960, she says, how did it happen that in 4 major presidential campaigns, Republicans were maneuvered into nominating candidates who did not campaign on the major issues? In other words, somebody behind the scenes was working with the Republican Party to make sure that the major issues were not addressed, and therefore Republican candidates would lose. And then why they would do this. It wasn't an accident. It was planned that way. In each of these campaigns, a small group of secret kingmakers using hidden persuaders and psyops to manipulate the Republican National Committee to nominate candidates who would sidestep or suppress the key issues. I know there's a lot of accusations at different points that Trump could have brought up a lot of issues that he didn't do. A lot of issues were sidestepped by both candidates, including climate change. It's supposed to be this dramatic issue, and yet both candidates didn't even talk about it. But find it interesting that in 1964, like I say, we see these same mechanisms at work, and she's talking about these kingmakers. And she says in this book, in 1936, a little group of kingmakers laid out long-range plans to control the Republican Party. They met in the Royal Suite on the 21st floor of the Waldorf Astoria in New York, and it included Thomas Lamont and Thomas Cochran, both senior members in the J.P. Morgan banking, at the J.P. Morgan Bank then. Alfred Sloan from General Motors was there, and 5 other financiers and industrialists. So it sounds very familiar, the same kind of people we see who met at Jekyll Island to set up the Federal Reserve System and the income tax system and everything else. Same people. But once again, here we have J.P. Morgan involved, and she says they are the kingmakers who chose, starting in 1936, started choosing the Republican presidential candidates, and starting in 1940. And in that year, they selected Wendell Willkie to lose because they didn't want Roosevelt foreign policy to change. So they were anti-Roosevelt, and they were certainly against his socialist policies to a certain extent in the New Deal, but they really liked the foreign policy and moving towards war. And interestingly enough, Wendell Willkie was a Democrat 5 years before that had never done anything at all for the Republican Party, and yet they used media and advertising firms to create this mythology that Wendell Willkie was the leading candidate. He came out of nowhere, but he was picked by the kingmakers. So all sounding fairly familiar. They manipulated the media to create it. Life magazine, Time magazine, Saturday Evening Post were all used. They hired the biggest advertising firms on Madison Avenue, and because the New York banking interests wanted war and wanted to continue those policies, so they steered the candidates that direction. And in fact, after the election, Willkie was exposed as a complete phony, and the details are great. Read them below. The kingmakers didn't care who won. Ultimately, they just wanted war. One person said, quote, "I believe I am serving the best interests of the Republican Party by protesting in advance and exposing the machinations and attempts of J.P. Morgan and the other New York utility bankers in forcing Wendell Willkie on the Republican Party. There is nothing to the Willkie boom for president except the artificial public opinion being created by newspapers, magazines, and the radio. The reasons behind all of this are money. Money is being spent by someone and lots of it. And the special interests of this country powerful enough to dictate to the American people? And the answer is yes. So even at the time, we had members of the own Republican Party who realized that they were being co-opted by the banks and their candidates chosen for them, artificially backed by the elitists in media, the same mechanisms we see today. And then in the 1944 election, the New York Kingmakers discovered and developed a new political weapon, the Gallup poll, and used these Gallup poll, which is barely based on any kind of reliable science, and yet it was used to create this mythology that people like Dewey and whoever the Kingmakers chose was going to be the best candidate. And once again, we see the similar mechanism today. And this time, of course, we see a lot of that being used for Hillary Clinton. Same thing with Hillary Clinton campaign. The Kingmakers fought Dewey in 1940, but all of a sudden in 1944, he became their candidate. And one of the reasons is because he abandoned his isolationist views. In 1940, he was an isolationist. And of course, by 1944, he was pro-war and therefore became a candidate for the Kingmakers. But the best, interesting enough, in this book, she talks about the best Republican issue at the time was Roosevelt had invited and knew about the attack on Pearl Harbor. That was their biggest issue in that campaign. And of course, they made sure that Dewey did not bring it up, and therefore to continue maintaining the foreign policy that they desired, and war not being an issue for Dewey. Dewey ran again in 1948. Oddly enough, Gallup predicted Dewey by a landslide. Of course, that turned out to be completely untrue. Dewey crashed and burned. And then 1952, Robert Taft, again, seemed like a natural for the nomination for the Republicans for president that year. The Kingmakers still didn't like his foreign policy and knew he couldn't be controlled. And so they started a campaign called, quote, "I like Taft, but Taft can't win," unquote, which is pretty brilliant as far as kind of a political rhetoric that we've seen. And that kind of thing still works, saying that granted he's a good candidate, but he can't win. And we still see all these decades later that whole idea that he can't win. So this time they selected Dwight Eisenhower, once again completely unqualified, but turned on the machinery again, planted people at Taft rallies. And that's another thing that we see, another tactic we see going on all the time now, just planting people at the Taft at the rallies, at the conventions, and hiring agent provocateurs, and also co-opting delegates, and a lot of times just bribing delegates. That's what happened in 1964 election, and 1952 election, and we still see that today, same kind of stuff. And interesting enough, in the 1952 election, New York Times said they were, quote, "frightened at the thought of a Taft presidency," unquote. And so there we have again this idea that the candidate can be so potentially devastating and so unhinged. In this case, Taft, who was a pillar of the Republican Party until he decided to run for president, and then he becomes a frightening prospect. And we see the same thing now, this whole idea that somehow Trump is frightening. So in 1952, we see all the same things. Texas delegates were disenfranchised. They changed the convention rules in last-minute situations, manipulation of delegate seatings, intimidation, and blackmail. And so through all their efforts, of course, Eisenhower runs on winning in Korea, stop coddling the communists, end corruption in government, and cut federal spending. And noticeably that all that stuff on that platform, once Eisenhower got elected, never happened. So it's kind of disappointing to find out that, of course, Eisenhower is just a stooge, and he was the candidate for the Kingmakers. And what better way for Eisenhower to observe the way that he was placed into power, and then later to give us a warning about the dangers of a shadow government and the military-industrial complex. So that makes a lot more sense looking at the big picture. But after 8 years of Eisenhower, we had the same foreign policy, a stalemate in Korea. There was no State Department house cleaning, and spending was higher than ever before. And in fact, Republicans lost 24% of the seats in Congress. And then Eisenhower elected in 1956, like I mentioned, and then Nixon being his vice president. And then in 1960, they realized that Nixon was going to be the front runner, but the Kingmakers didn't want Nixon because, once again, he couldn't be bought out, or so they thought at the time. And so the Kingmakers supported Nelson Rockefeller. And but then, eventually they bought out Nixon, and Nixon changed his platform, and so the Nixon legacy lived on. But then we get to 1964, and this is what really gets relevant. In 1964, the Republicans ran Barry Goldwater, and the people, the Kingmakers that he talks about, J.P. Morgan and the industrial corporate interests, could not control Barry Goldwater. So they started a campaign called, quote, anybody but Goldwater, unquote. And if that doesn't ring a bell to this current election with Trump, I don't know what is. That's the same thing tactic they've obviously been using once again for 50 years. Anybody but Goldwater. And so oddly enough, they were picking people like Nelson Rockefeller and George Romney, governor of Michigan, of course, who was Mitt Romney's father. And then they ended up going with the governor of Pennsylvania, William Scranton, and once again did the media blitz and created this mythology like he was the leading candidate, even though Barry Goldwater was the one they wanted. But and they painted Goldwater as more of a villain than LBJ, oddly enough, the Democrat. And they tried to say that Goldwater was in league with the neo-Nazis in Germany, and that Goldwater was evil, and that his supporters were extremists. And once again, he was a pillar in the Republican Party and the leading candidate, and yet by the time he ran, because they knew he couldn't be controlled, they used all the status quo people like George Romney. How funny that Mitt Romney comes back to play the same role his father did, but painting Goldwater as a villain and not LBJ, and saying that he was evil and aligned with Nazis. It's the same old story that we've seen so many times before. And then and the 1964 election had some interesting issues that we hear now too. The collapse of American foreign policy around the globe was a big issue. Losing the friendship of our NATO allies was a big issue. Russia as a major threat was a big issue. And candidates promising to increase respect for Americans abroad. And the same thing we see now with Trump, making America great again and trying to raise our opinion of people around the world in America. And, the fact that American foreign policy is collapsing around the globe again here in 2016, and then all the discussions of NATO and everything else. And then, of course, when you get to the bottom line in this book, one of the more interesting parts, at the end, she exposes the cast of characters, the Kingmakers, the J.P. Morgan Bank, and the corporate interests as none other than the Bilderberg Group. And of course, in 1964, she talks about the fact that they're a very cryptic and very secretive group, and talks about it in the context that not too many people were talking about at the time. But she said that top-level Democrats and top-level Republicans have close social, business, and political working relationships. So once again, we have a great source and book telling us that in actuality, for political expedition, there really is no difference between Democrats and Republicans, particularly when you get to the higher ranks and the social, business, and political contact and working relationships between them. But she discusses the Bilderberg Group too, and just as we know, of course, it's expanded considerably in the decades since, but at the time it was people like J.P. Morgan Bank, Chase Manhattan Bank, First National, Citibank, Washington Post, Newsweek, Look Magazine, Time, Life, New York Herald Tribune, all the movers and shakers that we would expect. Now the list is just 100 times longer with participants in those same media and government around the globe. So there we have it. Nothing new under the sun. The 1964 election has a lot of things that are eerily similar to the 2016 election. A lot of these comparisons can be made to a lot of elections throughout U.S. history, and the same kind of issues tend to rear their heads. Things that are couched in the same terms. We have the same kind of boogeymen, and also the manipulation inside the party, to control the Republican Party, and the Kingmakers decide that, and we have handlers who control the Democratic Party, the same group that controls the Democratic Party and is the Kingmakers for that party, choosing people like Hillary Clinton. So anyway, very interesting. History, as Mark Twain said, history doesn't repeat, but it certainly rhymes. And we certainly see that in this case, the 1964 election and now 2016. It's going to be an interesting day tomorrow, and hat tip to all my viewers out there. Quite a day tomorrow, isn't it? I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too.